Welcome to this presentation of the Great Bridge Historic Gateway Overlay District. This is an overview of a proposed new zoning overlay for the City of Chesapeake, and this presentation would have normally been given in a City Council or Planning Commission work session format. However, we're improvising today, maintaining our proper distances, but yet being committed to getting you the information that you need to consider these items. As you know, I'm Jaleh Shea. I'm the planning director for the city, and with me today is Mark Woodward, who is our comprehensive planning administrator. Moving on into our presentation, what exactly is the Great Bridge Historic Gateway Overlay? What we're proposing to do is to adopt an amendment to the city zoning ordinance that would be a new overlay district that would establish specialized standards for the Great Bridge area. And many of you will remember that the city adopted design guidelines for the Great Bridge Village back in 2008. However, those design guidelines were just that. They were guidelines, they were voluntary, and we never did actually incorporate those guidelines into any kind of zoning code. So this particular effort is going that next step and amending our zoning ordinance to include these standards. Why do we want to do this? Really, if you look here, there's some pictures of the existing conditions in Great Bridge, and this is kind of how the land uses have developed. They're sort of a hodgepodge. They're not very cohesive, and a lot of people have been concerned over the years, for many years, that we're really not maximizing the use of this area. There's a lot of historic significance in the Great Bridge area between both the Intercoastal Waterway and the battlefield, the Great Bridge battlefield site. There's also a lot of opportunity with the waterfront and commerce, and we're really just not taking advantage of that. This is today. This is what it looks like out there. So there's a lot of potential. This particular ordinance that we're looking to adopt would allow us to take advantage of those resources that are there, particularly the waterway, looking at maybe some development that would be related to that in terms of restaurants or waterfront type opportunities. Also to strengthen our community with the business community that we have in Great Bridge. We have a really strong local business community that's there. We'd also like to enhance the relationship with the historic battlefield with a new visitor center, and really to create something really special for the area. But ultimately, we want to ensure that the Great Bridge community maintains its vitality going into the future. This particular effort is important at a larger scale because, as you can see, there's a lot of bullets here, but there's a lot of issues that we do have in Great Bridge that we'd like to address. There's some concerns about how we promote our history, our cultural history here with Great Bridge and with a historic site. There's environmental benefits that we can gain from this because, as you know, there's a lot of environmentally sensitive areas in the area with some wetlands, and some of the land uses that we have there are actually probably not a good fit, particularly the heavy industrial uses that are there. We have some traffic issues that are there, and this plan promotes the certain measures that would help to improve the traffic conditions on Battlefield Boulevard. We also have some concerns about pedestrian safety in the area. There's a lot of people that would like to walk to the businesses and visit them, but it's not a very safe environment for people who are on foot or by bike. And then, of course, then there are economic benefits that can be realized for the businesses as well as the community by creating a place that's one that folks feel safe to visit and that are excited about visiting. And businesses could see some new opportunities, restaurants and that sort of thing, to capitalize on the waterway. So what exactly is a special overlay district? It is a tool that's used. It's a zoning tool, and what it does is it provides alternative development standards that recognize the special or unique characteristics of an area. And the special overlay district can be used to either provide flexibility, where the zoning code that we have, the standard codes may be a little too restrictive, or they can be tailored in a way that they may be more restrictive if you want to actually move things in a certain direction. They can provide additional regulations or relax them. An example of one of the overlay districts that we have in the city now is the Fentress Overlay District, and that one was developed to recognize the special conditions around the Fentress Airfield. And in that circumstance, we've actually provided the opportunity for some additional light industrial uses that might not have otherwise been permitted in that area. Another one of our overlays is the South Norfolk Business Overlay District, and that particular district provides additional regulations to try to promote a Main Street type of commercial corridor. So some of the setbacks that are there and design criteria are targeted specifically at creating that kind of environment. With the Great Bridge Historic Gateway Overlay District, we're kind of a combination of both of those elements. In some instances, we've added a few additional restrictions to try to make sure that growth happens in a certain way, or new development or redevelopment happens in a certain way. And then in other circumstances, we're actually loosen things up a little bit to help to incentivize some of revitalization in the area. But it's important to note that the Great Bridge Historic Gateway Overlay District is not a local historic district. Many of you will recall that we have a local historic district in South Norfolk, and in that case, that type of district is designed to preserve the existing conditions. And in the case of South Norfolk, the buildings, the houses, the structures there, that overlay is targeted at protecting those buildings and keeping them from being lost. In the case of the Great Bridge Historic Gateway Overlay District, we're not trying to protect the existing structures that are out there. We're actually looking for opportunities to have them revitalize and redevelop in a way that's going to be more cohesive and be better for the community as a whole. So, you know, how did we start to think about this? Really, this has been a discussion that's taken place for a very long time. When we replaced the Great Bridge Bridge many years ago, people started to really realize that we had an unrealized opportunity in Great Bridge, particularly with all the traffic that we have going down the waterway, not the road traffic, but the boats that we have, the intercoastal waterway. This is a key point on the East Coast. And there's a lot of traffic that stops here. $1 million yachts stop literally in Great Bridge and will moor and wait for the locks. And this is a known point where people can stop and get goods and services. And people started to notice that we had these folks that were mooring here and getting out and trying to navigate their way on foot to get the supplies they need, picking up groceries and other provisions, and really in very unsafe conditions. And meanwhile, we had other efforts that were going to help to recognize the historic battlefield site and the improvements that were happening there. And through this, it became, the awareness of what was actually happening in the area became greater and greater, and we realized that we had a lot of things that were going on that weren't necessarily supportive of that type of activity, and that we were probably missing out on a lot of opportunities. So City Council adopted back in 2008 the Great Bridge Village Design Guidelines to try to get things to get sort of cleaned up and moved in the right direction and to create more opportunity for the area. Those guidelines contain land use guidelines in there. There's actually recommendations, specific land use recommendations for certain parts of the study area. There's a causeway district that's identified as an area north of the canal, and the recommendation there was for mixed use land uses, including commercial, residential, office, that sort of thing. It does not recommend the heavy waterfront industrial uses that are existing there. And then there was also recommendations for the land uses south of the canal in the traditional business district, which was designated as the Great Bridge Business District. Those were recommended to be B1 neighborhood business district to have a village there, a commercial village that would be supportive of the community as a whole. The design guidelines also recommended an architectural design. Coastal colonial type theme is what has been recommended. There were streetscape designs included in the design guidelines, and those were focused on creating a more pedestrian-oriented environment with more safe types of of opportunities for people to move around through the district. And there were also recommendations for landscape design and street sections and plantings and that sort of thing. This full document is available online on the Planning Department's webpage. So to implement those design guidelines, there was a process that was outlined. Here it is on this slide, a whole series of things that required: a letter, a site plan, building plans, and submission of color schemes and landscape plans. And those would be given to the Planning Department for review. And that review and approval would be required prior to the submittal of a final construction plan. The only catch with that is that this compliance would be voluntary, and only if there was a requirement for some sort of discretionary approval, which would be something like a use permit, a conditional use permit, a street closure, or perhaps a rezoning. Everything else would have been considered by right zoning. So only if the landowner wanted to participate willingly would they be involved in this. We did have the opportunity to give them some relief from setback requirements as an incentive for participation, and to date I only know of one development that has chosen to participate and get that setback relief. So the big challenge is if you have everyone can participate only voluntarily if they want to, and we can only actually require compliance if there's a approval required, like a rezoning. We have very limited opportunity because the exhibit that you see in front of you here shows that virtually all of the study area is already zoned for development. It's zoned commercial or industrial, and there are very few approvals that are actually required to come in and have any kind of discretionary approval. An example of someone who was required to comply was McDonald's. McDonald's needed a use permit for its drive-through, and because of that, we were able to have them comply with the Great Bridge Village design guidelines. We think this is a good example of compliance with the design guidelines. I think McDonald's might have been a bit resistant at first. However, this is what they built, and we're very pleased with it, and I understand it is one of their most successful McDonald's, and when they were done and they saw what it was, what could be done, I think they're actually pleased with it as well. So I see this as a success story of what could be with the design guidelines. We also have another success story, very recently approved the Villages at Great Bridge. This development is a little bit to the south in the southern gateway area of the district, but as you can see, the developer was inspired by some of the existing architecture, specifically the Great Bridge School, and he chose to incorporate that into his design plan, and we're really excited about what the outcome is going to be for that, and we think this is going to be something that's going to be very complementary to the overall plan. Right now underway, there's the review and development of the Great Bridge Commons development. This is the person who chose to participate and get some setback relief. He's a voluntary participant. This is the first in the 100 block of Battlefield Boulevard South at the corner of Albemarle and Battlefield Boulevard. So that corner is going to be redeveloped into a very nice looking new commercial center. But we do have other development that has been occurring in the district, and here's examples of some more recent facelifts and renovations that have occurred in the area, and these folks have just simply chosen not to participate. And I would say, I would emphasize that there is development and investment going on in the corridor all the time. It's just most people are choosing not to participate with our plan. So what we're doing now is essentially taking things to the next level. It's been 12 years since the adoption of the design guidelines, and those examples I just gave you a moment ago are really the only opportunities that we've had to actually implement them. So this effort takes things to another level. I mean, essentially this is moving it from the policy and voluntary into a zoning overlay requirement, and so that new development and new redevelopment that's at a certain level would be required to comply with the standards that we have here. We have been working on this since before Christmas. We're interested in moving this forward because there are a lot of opportunities that we have out in the area. Here's an example of just some signs that are out there. You know there's interest, and folks, I've entertained quite a few calls of people calling me with what if I do this, how about this, how about that? And quite frankly, most of the ones that I do have run by me are not anything that I think that would have been something that the city would have liked to have seen on some of these properties. And they are located throughout the district. It's just as an example of some of the sites that are there that could or could not be developed with this plan. And you know, there is by right development potential on each one of these sites, and they may or may not actually be in something that would be supportive of our overall vision for the Great Bridge. So moving forward, I'm going to pass this off to Mark Woodward, who is going to now give you a detailed tour, if you will, of the proposed overlay district.
Thank you, Jaleh, and again, thank you for this opportunity. So this next series of slides that we're going to be covering will give you a bit more of the nuts and bolts, if you will, of what is contained in this proposed Great Bridge Historic Gateway Overlay District. So to begin with, just to give you a general overview, it is broken down into 4 unique character districts that generally follow the same districts that are contained in the 2008 Great Bridge Village Design Guidelines. So we have a causeway, a historic battlefield, a Great Bridge Village Business District, and then a South Gateway Character District. Each one of those character districts, as you'll see, has its own set of permitted and conditional uses, building design and heights, setbacks, and other such standards that are based closely on the original recommendations from the 2008 guidelines. However, they have been tailored somewhat to their particular geography within the overall Great Bridge Village area and how they contribute to the theme or the character of the overall overlay district. We'll also be discussing how each of the character districts is treated in terms of the new development and construction that Jaleh mentioned, in terms of the applicability, when the development standards kick in, so to speak, and then how the review process and the appeals process works under the proposed overlay district. Here we have an illustration of the boundaries, if you will, the coverage area of the 2008 design guidelines and then the proposed overlay district. You can see kind of immediately that they look very similar. As we've stated, the proposed overlay district builds upon the 2008 guidelines and is very closely associated with it. So looking at the left, you have the map there that shows the districts under the Great Bridge Village design guidelines. And we have there in the very top part a northern gateway, or what was called the Oak Grove Gateway District. Moving south from that in the blue color, you have the Causeway District, which, as its name suggests, is related to the Causeway area, the historic Causeway area. Below that, more of a horizontal district in the green is the Historic Battlefield District that encompasses the Intracoastal Waterway, the Great Bridge Bridge, a fair amount of public land, and then what is now the Great Bridge Battlefield Visitor Center and grounds for that. Below that in the darker green color is the Great Bridge Battlefield District, which, as Jaleh mentioned earlier, is kind of one of the core parts of the Great Bridge Village area. And then finally, south of that is the teal color, which is the South Gateway District. So moving to the right side, you see a very similar pattern of districts now that we're proposing to call them character districts. And as I'll show in a slide or two, we are actually proposing a few expansions of the boundaries of the 2008 guideline districts, and we'll explain why in just a moment. And here are the proposed expansion areas. We have them shaded in a light opaque yellow color with red numbers in them, and I'll explain each of those as we go along. But just to get you oriented, so the dark yellow lines are the boundaries of the design guidelines from 2008 and what we started with for the proposed overlay district. and then the shaded areas are areas that we're proposed to expand for various reasons for continuity with the overall proposed overlay district. So, as we had mentioned, the proposed overlay district would apply to new construction of new buildings, as well as renovations and exterior alterations where the cost of the improvement would equal or exceed 50% of the building's assessed value. So it would have to be a pretty substantial major exterior renovation, as you might guess. So again, just to repeat, it would apply to new construction and major exterior renovations or alterations. We want to emphasize that in all cases, there are grandfathering provisions in the zoning ordinance that would also remain in full force and effect for this proposed overlay district. So to put it in layman's terms, if a property owner continues to use their property as they are now, then essentially nothing would be affected in terms of the new overlay district requirements. So now with this next series of slides, I'm going to walk through each of the proposed character districts to give you an idea of what's involved with each one. And we'll start with the Causeway Character District, which is intended to be a mixed-use urban district that will be sensitive to the environmental areas around it with its design and construction, and it would be based on the MXDU, or Mixed Use Urban Zoning District. And as you see, I'm not going to read all of this, but the new development and construction would have to comply with things like a build-to line that would not to exceed 10% of the lot depth. This is a little bit different than a setback line, and we want to make that distinction. We're promoting a build-to line to, again, try to promote a pedestrian sense of scale and a sense of place and community with a build-to line that would also be able to accommodate outdoor dining, public plazas, landscaping, sidewalks, and those types of amenities. We continue to would have the requirement that buildings not exceed 4 stories. That's also in the 2008 guidelines, unless City Council were to approve taller buildings through approval of a conditional use permit. We are promoting the idea of shared access points through an access management plan that was created actually with the 2008 guidelines. And that would just be the idea to improve traffic safety, traffic flow, connectivity, and pedestrian safety through shared access points and a better coordination of turn in and turn out movements onto properties along Battlefield. We'll be showing you something in a few minutes in terms of how it's proposed to orient buildings and development away from Battlefield Boulevard in this area and to better utilize the side streets and the great waterway amenities that surround this Causeway district. There's also a desire to clean up sites as part of new construction and major renovations, again, to better fit and complement the environmental amenities and resources. And as I've already mentioned, there will be grandfathering provisions for existing businesses. Again, the proposed overlay district would apply only to new construction and alterations, major exterior alterations greater than 50% of assessed value. There are provisions for some residential development in a mixed-use type environment through approval by City Council, and that would have to adhere to the city's planning and land use policy. Here is a table that shows you a comparison of various regulations and standards that would be applicable in the Causeway Character District. On the far left, you would see the things that I had mentioned before, different types of land use elements, building heights, setbacks and build-to lines, parking, signage, landscaping. And so the column next to that on the left would be what is existing now under the zoning ordinance based on the zoning of the property. You can see there, again, I'm not going to read every one of those, but there are some existing regulations that apply to properties today. However, they really don't address design and architectural compliance, which is what we're going to be talking about and proposing. In the middle column, you have the 2008 Great Bridge Village Design Guidelines recommendations, and as Jaleh had mentioned earlier, these are voluntary in almost all cases. You see there, as I mentioned, as far as building heights, up to 4 stories, perhaps higher with a conditional use permit. There are setbacks under the guidelines as opposed to build to lines. The colonial and southern colonial or coastal colonial with neutral colors and native vegetation was promoted under the 2008 guidelines. Parking should be hidden from views and based on the use, and then a pedestrian orientation as far as signage. At the very bottom you see there, how is residential regulated? Under the 2008 guidelines, the recommendation was that it must be included in a land use mix with design requirements. And then finally on the far right is what is being proposed under the overlay district. And you'll see a lot of similarities to the 2008 guidelines going down and comparing the various land use standards. However, we are now promoting a build-to line of 0 to 10% of lot depth. And another thing I would point out is the signage requirements are a bit more specific in order to promote that type of sense of place and wayfinding that would be complementary to the Great Bridge Village. And then finally, residential uses may be included in a land use mix with a conditional use permit under the proposed overlay. So I mentioned the idea earlier of trying to orient buildings in a fashion that would create a sense of place, a sense of community, and to complement the environmental areas. This map illustrates that. You see the roadways and potential roadways that are highlighted with a yellow and black hash mark designation. Those are what we intend in the future to be front-facing streets for building orientation. So in other words, moving forward into the future, when new construction or major alterations are required, the idea would be to have the front facade of the building, the presentation of the building, to orient on those streets that are indicated with those yellow and black hash marks. In some cases, it would still be Battlefield Boulevard. In other cases, it would be existing side streets such as Northfield Street up in the north there, Tilden Avenue, Billy Floral Way. And then in other cases, it would be for frontages along the waterways, such as the Cove, as we call it, on the western side of Battlefield Boulevard. Again, the idea is to have some uniformity and complementary frontages for buildings that would promote that sense of place. I mentioned earlier some of the expansion areas that we are talking about and proposing under the overlay district, and I'll start with the first couple here that are in the Causeway district. You'll see that they have red numbers in them. It might be a bit hard to see, but it's number 1 and number 2 on the west and east side of Battlefield Boulevard, just south of its intersection with Great Bridge Boulevard and Kempsville Road. These are considered to be the northern approaches to the Causeway Character District from the north. And technically speaking, they're not really expansion areas because they are included in the 2008 guidelines. However, in the 2008 guidelines, they are part of the Oak Grove or North Gateway. Now we are proposing to include them in the Causeway Character District because we feel that it would be complementary to the approach to the main Causeway District. And by including these areas, it would also provide a little bit more uniformity in the visual aesthetics of the area and trying to clean up incompatible design and land use, as well as some visual clutter of the area. So next we come to the historic Battlefield Character District just south of the Causeway District. And as I mentioned earlier, this encompasses mostly public lands either owned by the city or the Army Corps of Engineers east and west of Battlefield Boulevard and the Great Bridge Bridge. You would see there to the west, it would include the Locks Park that the city operates, the locks themselves, the property owned by the Corps of Engineers for maintenance, and then on the east side, of Battlefield Boulevard. It encompasses the Great Bridge Battlefield Visitor Center and grounds, as well as the trail that runs pretty much all the way to the Chesapeake Expressway Bridge. And the idea here would be to continue to protect and complement those historic uses and those primary uses. The future land uses should be compatible with the visitor center and museum, its architectural and grounds landscaping style. We're promoting the use of colonial architecture and more traditional colors. Landscaping and gardens, the vegetation should be native and complementary of historical arrangements. And then we would seek recommendations from the City Council appointed Historic Preservation Commission for new construction approval going forward. Again, we have a table here similar to the one I showed you for the Causeway District that is very similar in the same setup. On the left, we have various types of land uses, building heights, parking signage, those types of things. Then we have the existing regulations that you see there, the next column from the left, the 2008 guideline recommendations, and then on the right, the historic gateway overlay. You would see very few changes between the 2008 guidelines and the proposed historic overlay district standards here, because as I said, we're trying to preserve and promote that historic battlefield, that core part of the Great Bridge area as it is. We do have one proposed expansion area in the battlefield district, and it is a large marshy area that you would see if you're traveling along Battlefield Boulevard on the east side of the Battlefield Boulevard. It's actually primarily owned by the city of Chesapeake, and as I said, it's very tidal, very marshy. It is definitely wetlands. However, just looking again to the future, not knowing what future regulations might be or future plans might be, the idea is to include this so that it is complementary and protective of the historic battlefield character district and would be environmentally responsible to that going forward. And we included it with the battlefield district because we feel that because of the vistas that you would see from the trail and the Battlefield Visitor Center and the characteristics, that it's really complementary to that district. So continuing south along the corridor, we come next to the Great Bridge Business Character District, which is an existing district under the 2008 guidelines. We are now sort of organizing it as a character district, and we intend for it to continue to be a community scale village with improved design that relates to the history of the area. We would continue to promote community and neighborhood oriented businesses that would be compatible with the B1 zoning district. We feel that that's appropriate for this area and its village feel, its neighborhood business feel. Below that, you would see some of the new development and construction standards that will be included in the overlay district. Development would continue to generally be oriented towards Battlefield Boulevard as it is now. We would be promoting more community engagement through outdoor dining, public plazas, improved landscaping and sidewalks, and parking to the rear is an important element. As it is now, buildings would not exceed 2 stories unless City Council were to approve a higher building through a use permit. That's what we have now. Again, as with the Causeway District, we'd be promoting shared access points along Battlefield Boulevard to improve traffic flow, traffic movement, coordinating that with pedestrian safety for an overall improved travel experience for both motorists and pedestrians. And as before, there would be grandfathering provisions for existing businesses in this character district as well. So not to sound too repetitive, but only new construction and major exterior renovations would be subject to the new development standards. As I will mention in a minute regarding a new opportunity for some mixed-use residential, the planning and land use policy would apply in that case. And I will transition to the Great Bridge School Architectural Compatibility Zone in just a moment. But first, before we show that, As you've seen now with the other two character districts, here's a table that sort of organizes and compares the various standards and regulations for the Great Bridge Business Character District. Again, we have the same types of land use elements, parking, signage, building heights. There you see the existing regulations, which are generally based on B1 or in some cases B2 in terms of building heights and those types of standards. The Great Bridge, 2008 Great Bridge Village Design Guidelines, you see those in the middle column there. Again, we're promoting the colonial and southern colonial or coastal colonial architecture, neutral colors, native vegetation. Parking lots should be behind buildings and hidden from view. That was a recommendation from 2008. Pedestrian-oriented signs, and then finally no additional residential. However, existing residential is grandfathered. And then if you move to the right column, you see a lot of complementary development standards to the 2008 guidelines. Same building heights, except with a conditional use permit. Again, we're promoting the idea of a build-to line of between 0 and 10% of lot depth to promote, again, that uniformity, that sense of community and gathering. And then the signage requirements are, again, a bit more specific in order to promote some uniformity and complementary signage to the overall Great Bridge Village area. New residential is only allowed in the school compatibility zone, which I'm going to cover in just a minute, if part of a mixed-use project and with a conditional use permit approved by City Council. We have the same idea here in the Great Bridge Business Character District for orienting buildings and the front facades of buildings to what we consider to be front-facing streets. And again, we have the yellow and black hash mark to indicate which streets we're talking about. Generally, it continues to be Battlefield Boulevard throughout this particular character district, as well as some of the side streets that are approaches to the corridor, Mount Pleasant Road and Johnstown Road. If you look in the very north part of this exhibit, you'll see that we are also promoting a front-facing concept for vistas or properties that actually front or view to the Chesapeake and Albemarle Canal or the Intracoastal Waterway. Again, we want to promote the highest and best use and the best sense of relating to this core part of the Great Bridge Village area. Now, I've mentioned a couple of times this Great Bridge School Architecture Compatibility Zone. That's quite a mouthful, but what we're trying to create here is a zone, if you will, or an area around the historic Great Bridge School, the three-story Great Bridge School that you see very prominently at the intersection of Mount Pleasant and Battlefield. And what we've created is an area or a zone around that where new development would be sensitive to the scale of that Great Bridge School and complementary in terms of its massing and its height. So here, buildings shall be no more than 3 stories, whereas in the rest of the Great Bridge Character Business District, it is only 2 stories. Here, buildings up to 3 stories are allowed. If residential is proposed on upper floors of such a 3-story building or a multi-story building, a conditional use permit would be required from City Council for that. We are also trying to promote the idea of preserving the existing mature trees that you see dotted around within this particular zone. We think that they're very important, they're historic in their own right, and that they contribute to the historic feel of this Great Bridge School area. So within the Great Bridge Business Character District, we have a couple of more areas that are proposed for expansion from the 2008 design guidelines. And I may have failed to mention this before, but as far as creating these various expansion areas, they came from a couple of sources. We had some public workshops for this proposed overlay district back at the end of January, and we received a number of comments from the public that attended that there were areas directly adjacent to and associated with the boundaries of the Great Bridge Village Design Guidelines that they felt should be included because they were commonly known or felt to be part of the Great Bridge Village area and should be either protected or be able to contribute to that. So that's generally how we came to include some of these areas, as well as staff, the city staff's review and analysis of the areas and the comments and what we were trying to achieve with the proposed overlay district. So here we have an area that's in the Great Bridge Business District. It's west of the Battlefield Boulevard, and it's considered to be the 100 block of Wilson Drive. So it would be on the east side of Wilson Drive between Albemarle Drive and Reservation Road or Callison Drive. These are single-family homes. There are maybe one or two duplexes there, but it's primarily single-family homes. And what we're trying to do with including this area is to protect them if other businesses or properties that front on Battlefield were to be redeveloped. We want to make sure there are protections for these properties within the existing neighborhood and ensuring that future development would be compatible with the overlay district standards, including access management. We want to emphasize that the proposed overlay district standards are intended to apply only to commercially zoned properties, not residentially zoned properties. So as long as these properties remain zoned for residential, they would not be subject to the development standards. The property would need to be redeveloped to a commercial use, and then they would be required to adhere to those various development standards. Then moving on to the other side, the east side of Battlefield Boulevard, still within this Great Bridge Business Character District, is an undeveloped area that is adjacent to and owned by the Tidewater Yacht Agency that we felt, because of its location, its prominence in terms of being across the river, so to speak, from the historic Battlefield site and the visitor center, and also kind of being a gateway into the Great Bridge Business District, that should be included as well, again, to make sure that future development would be compatible with the development standards for this overlay district, but particularly the Great Bridge Business Character District. And then also still within this same district, the Great Bridge Business Character District, we have now proposing to include the entire buildings and grounds for the Great Bridge Middle School. Previously, for the 2008 guidelines, this area was not included at all. But again, we received a number of comments during our workshops and from other city staff that we should consider including this area because it does relate to the Great Bridge School, the three-story Great Bridge School property just to its north, as well as its relationship to the approaches to the area, both Battlefield Boulevard and Mount Pleasant Road. So we are proposing to include that. You see the Great Bridge Middle School, the Colin Hall Stadium, and then there are a couple of private commercial uses that front on Mount Pleasant Road that are also included in this proposed area. And then there's a smaller area on the north side of Mount Pleasant Road. It's indicated by the number 7 there, that includes a strip shopping center, a veterinary clinic, a church, child daycare, a bank, and a legal office. So a variety of uses along that. We included it, again, because it is a very important approach to Battlefield Boulevard corridor, and we wanted to ensure future compatibility with the standards, as well as complementing the Great Bridge School property just across the street. So finally, we get to the South Gateway Character District, the southernmost district of the overall Great Bridge overlay. This, again, was a district within the 2008 guidelines, and we are including it also in the proposed overlay district. The purpose for this district, both with the 2008 guidelines as well as our proposed overlay, is to create a good compatible transition between the main Great Bridge Historic Gateway and Village area, which again would be the Causeway District, the Historic Battlefield District, and the Business District. So we're providing a transition from that through Battlefield Boulevard corridor to the Transportation Corridor Overlay District further to the south. And the TCOD policy was a policy adopted by City Council to promote and preserve economic opportunities along major corridors. And it does reach up into the southern part of the Great Bridge Village corridor area. So the South Gateway begins to transition to TCOD, and its southernmost reaches down just south of Hanbury Road there in the southern part. The standards here are tied really more to existing underlying zoning of properties, as well as the recommended standards that are in the TCOD policy. And so because of that, things like building setbacks and standards would also be based on the underlying zoning. However, we are, as with other parts of the overlay district and the corridor, the idea is to promote well-buffered pedestrian features, to have very nice landscaping verges, to sort of create a uniform and a nice design feel for experience for travelers and pedestrians. And again, the building design for complementary purposes would be desired to be colonial, southern colonial, or coastal colonial in this particular character district. And again, just to help provide more of a comparison, we have another table that shows the various land use elements and types for this particular character district. The existing regulations that are in place now based on the underlying zoning for properties, the 2008 guidelines in the middle, and then the historic overlay district guidelines on the right. And you will see a lot of compatibility and similarity between the 08 guidelines and the proposed overlay district. Because as I said, we are, for this particular Southern Gateway district, we are basically relying on the underlying zoning and the TCOD standards and not really introducing much in the way of new development standards. There are a couple of proposed expansion areas in the South Gateway district as well. The one in the north, it's a fairly small area with a red number 8 on it. It includes a couple of vacant properties just north of Allen Drive that previously were not in the 2008 design guidelines area, but we felt that for future development purposes that should be covered, again, to maintain that compatibility. Similarly, going south a little bit, you see an area with the red number 9 on it. This area, these properties fronting on Battlefield were not in the 2008 guideline boundary, but again, for future compatibility and adherence to development standards, we felt like it was important to include this area as well. I've mentioned a couple of times the access management plan and the desire throughout all of these character districts to try to have an improved experience for motorists as well as pedestrians. And how we want to achieve that is through the Great Bridge Village Access Management Plan, which was actually created back in 2008 to be complementary to the 2008 Great Bridge Village Design Guidelines so that they would work together. However, as Jaleh had mentioned, because of the voluntary nature of the 2008 guidelines, it has been difficult to achieve the type of shared access and coordinated traffic movements and improvements that ultimately would be the best for this for the Great Bridge Village area. So the key to it would be to manage access points and turning movements, which you can see. It's a little bit difficult to see here on this particular exhibit, but you have the red triangular markers that show where the desired curb cuts would be and would be organized to, and this would be through sharing of access, sharing of driveways going into the future. And we also are proposing some median crossovers, which would be the green dots that you see which would again be efforts to sort of promote pedestrian safety and promote the idea of being able to come from your neighborhood or riding your bike and get to amenities along the corridor safely and in an organized fashion. So kind of transitioning from that same idea, we are definitely trying to promote connectivity under this proposed overlay district. We really feel like that's key to helping the Great Bridge Village area, which really has, as Jaleh mentioned, has tremendous opportunity and really, in many respects, could reach higher levels in terms of it being an amenity and a valued asset for residents, visitors, workers, and so many. And connectivity is important to that. So connecting people to work, live, play within the district and to the amenities that are there. Promoting connectivity between the character districts so that each one isn't kind of seen as its own standalone village or district or zone. We really want to promote how the character districts work with each other to promote the overall Great Bridge Village area. Great Bridge Boulevard is a very important north-south connector for Chesapeake. There's no disputing that, but there is a desire to promote alternatives to the automobile, including sidewalks and nice promenades that would connect neighborhoods to businesses and to the wonderful recreation opportunities that exist there. So we want to try to create safer, wider crosswalks, median crossovers, and nice crossovers that create refuges for pedestrians through this heavily trafficked area. So having said all that and reviewed all these character districts and the development standards, we begin to kind of wrap up by talking about how this would be implemented. So we have an existing design review process for development in the planning department. So new development and major exterior renovations would be, the review of that would be administered by the planning department. We would definitely encourage pre-submittal conversations with property owners or agents or developers who are going to be subject to the development standards for new construction or renovations. Early communication is important, so it allows really for creativity, innovation, brainstorming between the city and what we're trying to achieve with the overlay district, as well as the property owner and what they're trying to achieve with their goals, so that all of the aesthetic and environmental goals for the district can be met. There would be various submittal requirements that are not really much different than what we would require today as part of our architectural review. Contact information for the applicant, site plans, building plans, photographs, other kind of background documentation to help us get a really good feel for what's being proposed. The plans would be reviewed by a design review committee that consists of staff from planning, the zoning office, and engineering staff. And we would strive to achieve a timely review of plans within a 2-week period. And it's important to note that the review would also need to include compliance with whatever applicable state and local codes would come into play. So if a site plan is required, then this design review that I mentioned would take place prior to the final plan approval. And again, early communication and coordination is important for a successful review. If no site plan is required, then the design review would take place prior to the issuance of a building permit for whatever the improvement is. And I would want to emphasize now that regular and routine maintenance of buildings would not require design review. This is a concern that we heard from people that came to the public workshops, existing business owners with existing buildings. Repainting a building, doing that kind of regular maintenance would not require this design review process. However, exterior painting shall be equivalent under this proposed overlay district to a color palette that's known as the Benjamin Moore Historical Collection. That is a standard that is being used in the South Norfolk Business Overlay District, for example, that Jaleh mentioned earlier. And we would want to utilize that for this particular proposed overlay district. If a paint color that someone is proposing to use to do regular maintenance, repaint their building, does not conform to that, then approval would be required by the planning department. We would allow accent colors on buildings, but they shouldn't exceed 20% of the overall building's facade. That we would have an appeals process for planning department decisions, and you can see a very simple flow here where within 30 days of the department's decision, the applicant would need to file an appeal to the Planning Commission. If they were not satisfied with the Planning Commission, then it would move to the City Council, and ultimately the ultimate recourse would be the Circuit Court. And enforcement of the various development standards would be under the existing zoning code enforcement procedures and the tables of permitted and conditional uses. And I meant to mention that on this illustration you see a sample of some of the colors that are in this color palette, and really it does allow for a variety of tones and colors within the district. And with that, I will now conclude my series of slides, and I've tried to give you some of the nuts and bolts of what's included in the proposed overlay district, and now Jaleh will sort of wrap up our presentation.
Thanks, Mark. That was a very thorough overview. I really appreciate all the detail you put into that, and hopefully that will answer a lot of questions that people had about the overlay. But here I'm going to wrap us up and kind of go through the process of where we are and where we're going. What you see in front of you now is the original timeline that was presented to City Council back in November. And this timeline reflected all the required studies and plans and things that we need to do. There are actually some requirements by law that needed to be incorporated to actually develop a zoning overlay. And we worked through those requirements through the months of November and December and into January, doing the various studies and putting together the concepts and working through different issues and seeing what the ordinance would actually end up looking like. And then we used the first, part of January, we began our stakeholder input process for this. And the stakeholder input involved 2 community workshops. We consulted with the Historic and Architectural Review Board, the Historic Preservation Commission, and we actually met with a few different groups from the business community as well as some community members. And we gathered that input and we folded that into the process with the goal of having a draft ordinance ready for the Planning Commission's consideration in March. That was our goal. And we did present that at that time, and with a goal of having something to City Council in April. As you know, Planning Commission continued this item for 60 days, and so we have updated the process calendar to reflect that continuance. And so now, here we are, this is May. So this item is scheduled for public hearing on May 13th, which is actually next week for us. And assuming council, if Planning Commission does actually act on it in May, then we would see this going to City Council in June at their regular planning public hearing. So as I said, this is a recording of what would have been the work session that Planning Commission had requested. City Council's also requested a work session, and we think this video hopefully would be helpful for them as well. But to that end, we are interested in the feedback that you might have or questions that you may have. So please let us know if you look through this and you see anything that you have more information that you would like to see. Contact us. Give me a call. Call the Planning Department, 382-6176. Or you could email your questions to either me or to the Planning or to Mark, or to the Planning Department's email address, which is planning@cityofchesapeake.net. The slides from this presentation will be available for you at your convenience off of our Planning Department webpage. We actually have a project page for this effort, and all the materials that have been prepared thus far, including the ordinance, or the staff reports and everything, Those are all available to you anytime you like on our webpage. But if you do have any questions, comments, suggestions, anything, please feel free to pass those on to us. So with that, we'll conclude our work session. Thank you.